All right, there are a few things that I would like to address here. Uh, when we have a situation where public institutions, for reasons best left to epidemiologists and virologists, believe that they have to shut down, where they cannot uh, undertake the responsibilities for which they are instituted, responsibilities which entail the mediation of relations between society apart from carrying out vital functions such as education, such as banking, such as correspondences, um, which they are supposed to. Uh, a civil society of any um, degree of coherence, I mean, any kind of association which does not basically begin and stop with the person adjacent to you, would need to find new ways, new forms to be able to share what it is that their lives consist of, to be able to share experiences. Um, Now, this may require a degree of formal invention. However, it would also perhaps require a labor of a kind, a labor of consideration, and for whatever it's worth, when, for instance, a writer such as myself does not find platforms uh, willing or able to post their work and to be able to uh, receive a wage which may be able to support myself for it, I would have to find ways in which I can share it via other means, and YouTube does provide me a site via which I could perhaps present my work. And this is what I'd like to do right now. And in many ways, I have been doing it, and this is a summation of a series of papers that I've been reading out, this being the latest one, and I think it addresses a set of concerns that you may find to be pertinent. Uh, Also, I've not been careful enough about being close to the mic. If you have difficulties hearing me, wear some headphones, increase the volume. I'm sure you'll be able to figure something out. Let me begin now, okay? Uh, the title of the paper is Bodily Alienation, the Limits of Perception, and the Question of Reification. I seek to be able to reach an audience as a writer, to be able to have people consider my state of being and the way my essence squirms, is twisted and extinguished in these squirmings. I say this out of a singular satisfaction, that of representing a present state of affairs where consideration, perhaps that facet of the mind most necessary to consider a work of art or to be cognizant of another life, is what is sorely lacking. As such, this is what I will ask of you. For as a reader today, you have a special responsibility. You would require not merely to read these characters via which I form words and sentences following their argument, but you may perhaps unconsciously have to be able to see the kind of life which represents a document as such. In other words, I call for a sympathetic reading, and it is unfortunate that I have to state this explicitly. Yet, in a world where advertisers and critics are commoner than the lights on streets, such a statement may be called for, if nothing else, to set a text apart from what it is not, which leaves the question, what is a text? A text is a representation, and the choice of what is represented is ultimately the author's. The author may not be an authority, and the circumstances of the production of a text may be beyond his jurisdiction. In other words, a text mediates for the author a place before which he may place his thoughts. A place which, though of his making, may not be determined by him, or at least not to the extent to which a situation may seek to determine him. For I was once told by a professor in the university, or at least read a comment on his wall on Facebook, proclaiming that the reason you write is because you cannot fuck. Excuse my language. Profanities aside and my lack of virility, what I seek to indicate in these configurations is a kind of bodily alienation which is experienced today. The form in which this alienation, genealogically a social phenomena in as much as its concept goes, is experienced bodily, could be a novel development. For today, in our enmeshment in a communicational interface via computers and cell phones, in our dependency on such relay mechanisms to ascertain the present state of our supply lines, in gauging from such a place what we can and cannot do, we find that our decision making is shown from our conscious mind and is made to exist, if such a word is still applicable, or hinge on conditions beyond it. In this sense, alienation becomes bodily and not merely an, an incommensurability which arises between narratives harbored by people which are incommensurable, though I think my formulation takes account of such a scenario as well. Cognitively, it helps to be able to map such a situation via an analogy. And when an analogy is drawn from a form of practice that is familiar, it generally leads to a tighter construction. Since I practice calisthenics, a very bodily discipline, and advocate the same, I'd like to present the example of a movement which may presently be beyond the capabilities of the person attempting it. Most of you, for example, including me, would not be able to do a handstand push up. This is not a question of mere intent, will, or honesty. I mean, you would not be physiologically able to perform the movement. The possibility of doing so arises not in attempting easier variations, repeatedly getting comfortable with the load and noticing progress when it occurs. What does a discipline call for? A discipline is a mere roadmap from getting to a place you are at to a place you want to be. I have found that in a place where hustle is the name of the game, rest between exertions are perhaps as important as the work you put in. In the case of a strength building exercise, such as the handstand push up, you would have to eat well enough for your body to be able to repair the tissue so that it can heal up to become stronger. Literature on this process is not difficult to find. The experience of it, however, is slow, requires consistency and patience, aspects which a world with their wish on fingertips often fails at getting a handle on. However, bear in mind, what I offer is an analogy. For a calisthenics move that you cannot presently perform is not the horizon of your alienation. Where, for instance, is your memory stored? How would you have access to it? What do we mean when we say that I remembered where it was? Were you searching for your keys? I think such a gamut of questions would require to confront the perhaps simpler question, which in its very formulation has the inklings of an answer. What makes an experience memorable? Memory, as the prior suggestive sentence indicates, is an impression we have of the world, an impression bound to a moment, perhaps a touch, a sensation, like reading or listening to a voice, etc. They pass. Yet, in their passing, we still have their memories. There may be some who would say that what makes you you are your memories. Without them, you would be someone else. Would you even have the same body that you inhabit? Well, if you are truly oblivious to how you live in the flesh vehicle you are in, you may not have it for very long. And this brings us to that facet which no one really thinks about, yet everyone does: forgetting. What does one forget? I may forget that I have an engagement this afternoon with my family for lunch, for instance. I may not recall the second name of my best friend from the fourth grade. I may no longer remember, after many days of work, what a great holiday felt like. Forgetting has many forms. Yet, in our acts of memory, in that, in the tokens we create to commemorate a moment, in a photograph, a letter, a postcard, an email, in art, perhaps in a story, we create ways in which we can explain such happenings to ourselves. And there is a sense of magic in the ability to create happenings via such forms which never happened. Fiction does this and is captivating because of it. There is a truth to the creation involved in writing fiction which a report could not hope to bear an equivalence to. This is not a matter of the story itself, which sometimes may indeed be similar, but a matter of writing. When an author conceives of a character, he does not perhaps see them fully formed, all in a moment, all at once. Like the doctor who pulls a child out of a womb, often the character is not born complete, and often not even in one piece. I should have probably said, unlike the doctor who pulls the child out of the womb. I may recall a handshake. I may recall very many handshakes. And depending on what we may have been doing together, have a sense of what they may have meant. I may recall a goodbye, and I may recall a greeting. Like you, I believe, perhaps very many of them. The question which remains is what makes one memorable. This is not a question of mere routine. I may remember very precisely a movement that I have done 1,000 times. I may know the precise muscles that require to be activated in my glutes and back to be able to arch my back up off the floor. I may be able to do so rhythmically, in tune with my breath, to the point where in doing it, I can half forget the movement itself. But I remember the movement. I have not forgotten it. What is memory? Something out of the ordinary is really not memorable. There are more occurrences in this universe than God would care to take cognizance of. His omnipotence usually seems selective. Accidents, for instance, seem to bother us inasmuch as they become memorable when the pain was sharp enough to leave some kind of scar. Physical, yes, but often mental as well. An insult, a banishment, a rebuke, a disparaging remark, often too form, however slight, memories. We are not merely our memories now, are we? I tend to judge a person by the distance they keep from their memories. A person whose mind is like a photo album is captivated in a picturesque world for certain. Yet the place of memory, since it isn't all there, all at once, even for the person concerned, is not easy to gauge, even more for another than for the person themselves. I don't know what you recall, though I know that in sitting on a chair, reading a note like this, you unconsciously compare its similarities and differences to text, to the sensations it recalls, and to what they mean to you. Occasionally, for instance, a critic may see in a poem a style characteristic of another era, or a motif that would usually appear in another genre. Novelty in its rawest kind is gibberish, and we make sense of the world only in comparison to what is already in it. Memory here is perhaps subject to the norms of perception itself. I think it is important that we have got here, and were you to retrace these footsteps, you would see that it has not been easy. Has it even been a journey? I cannot tell. A movement which is beyond me would have to indicate to the one reading this whether they did or did not already hold something akin to the belief or proposition that memory is subject to perceptual norms. A strange and fantastic situation, as it were, as that which we remember is often not in our direct perception. Yet, for us to remember it in any meaningful sense requires that we must have perceived it somewhere. Being able to mark a memory to a place and time allows us to construct a relation between it and other memories, and from such associations, a narrative emerges. Narratives are fundamentally what explain to us as to what may have been happening. Without them, I don't think we would be able to explain what is going on to another. Crucial, too, for any sense of progress, for setting a routine, for a discipline. I remember, for instance, that at 3 o'clock today, I have to do handstand push ups. This does not mean I can do handstand push ups. I can do simpler variations like pike and Hindu push ups. I may practice a handstand against a wall first, do a few shoulder rotations, get into the hollow body hold against a wall, and see how far I can lower myself while still being able to push myself up upright. With time, I will gradually increase the depth. With repetition, I gradually would get stronger. Week by week, I would notice these changes. Charting this in its most reduced form could be a kind of narrative. A poor one, certainly, and in encountering it, one cannot but think why it is done, and such an inquiry would, of course, hinge on so many other facets of a life, which, like another's memory, remain on the whole, ambiguous to us. A wish, for example, when fulfilled, is memorable. A promise, when redeemed, leaves an impression, and these are hard to forget. Which is not to say that we don't, yet perhaps, or at least this is the hope of learning, having been through these experiences, was something similar to a rise, whatever it may be, were we to have a correlative analogy or point of comparison, if only as a juxtaposition. We may seek to place this new facet alongside or against the dimension of our experiences. This makes it a little less alien and a little more noble. But what is this minuscule degree of familiarity or similarity? Were we to leave it at just that, which we may be referring to, let us say it is a word or concept associated with a memory which to us makes it relatable in a cognizant way, where we can, for instance, name the relation itself to that facet of alterity encountered. I recall once arguing about what a metaphor was with my English professor, and I think this may have been the underpinnings of the conundrum as I retrieved them. Of course, I guess the details and the devil are often mixed up in such affairs, and how we got to that predicament is perhaps constitutive of a context which disappears when there seems to be a fixation on a disagreement. In fact, I would say that the greatest trick the devil pulled was not to make people believe he doesn't exist, but to let them confuse him for the circumstances that they are in. A moment of forgetting, as it were. So let us recap. We have bodily alienation as something akin to the inability to complete a demand or address a certain desire we feel. Metaphor as a conceptual tool we use allows us to describe it to someone else. We may say, for instance, to a doctor that I felt my insides squirm. This does not mean that someone's insides actually squirmed, though it may describe a sensation. Similarly, a poet may proclaim that their hand was guided by the muse, a flowery metaphor, but one which is evident to anyone. And amidst this, we can, or rather, seek to communicate something resembling a narrative, a sequence of events let us trace, which lets us trace relations between such happenings, and along the way, perhaps answer questions such as how or why an event may have occurred, what caused it, and what did those who witnessed the phenomena do. Of course, a narrative much like this one can take place all in your head. And the key is to remember that all of them, in fact, do. But where were we? Ah, yes. What makes something memorable? At this final point, the question of pleasure cannot be avoided. For our wisdom and moral aside, time has a way of selecting what we would rather recall rather than what we may choose to forget. This is more true to any collectivity than it is to an individual, who may yet resist them in his or her own ways. Earlier in the text, I brought up the naming of a relation and how we perceive it. Without pleasure, without the ability to enjoy, it is that we are consciously seeking to do. Sorry, let me trace the sentence. Without pleasure, without the ability to enjoy what it is that we are consciously seeking to do, we may easily forget what we need it for. For the price of this effort may be too high. We may know of another way to reach the same goal. But sometimes, such as perhaps in politics, the means themselves are enough. even if they change the goal that was pursued. In fact, this may be the point, to change the destination, which is why we practice what we do, to effectuate a change in this world which we deem to be desirable. The question that I would leave you here with is, how can we think of this relation without reference to something akin to a pleasure principle as articulated by Freud, even if our practice is formalized by resistances we face to its consummation? How may I choose to direct how I may choose to direct this to the Marxist amongst us is whether this alone makes it an aspect which is reified. The fact that we may have done something out of or directed by or driven through a pleasure principle. Would that make it a moment of reification? And here I would object, for as long as the form which labor takes is self consciously chosen for purposes definable, hence making the procedure shareable, we are not speaking in any private language. Shorn of metonymy, we confront what is the presence of heterogeneity, exteriority, and indifference that any form of life finds in nature as such, with which a dialectical sublation, to my understanding, is yet best left to Hegel. Anyway, this was the paper that I wrote. I present a reading here to indicate the circumstances in which it may have been written, if that is any indication, the enunciation, the articulation of the content itself. Of course, there are fundamental differences between the voice and the gaze and the hand that writes, and the kinds of memory and practices and associations that guide these processes. However, I think it also does help to be able to project to a space what a practice in private may be. And I think that's what makes a kind of association with others possible, a kind of sharing which need not be within the confines of the gaze alone, which is yet what I would identify as the significant moment in its production. I hope I have not grated against your patience. This is a paper that I've written maybe mostly yesterday and today. I am looking for any journals, any magazines, any publications of any kind which would be interested in having it on their page, failing which I will share it publicly and leave a link in the description below. If you have comments, observations, criticism, I think that is what this paper does call for very concretely, very strongly, then please do offer them in any way you can. A comment would be great. If you have another perspective, or if you believe that there is something that I should consider that I have not, bring it to my notice. I'll see how it may possibly be addressed, because I think the problems that were raised in this are yet and remain very much universal. And with that, I will wish you a good evening and thank you for your time. Bye bye.